as well, you should now be able to see me. If you can't see me, you are probably being spared, so don't worry about it. So I'm here to talk to you today about survey design. This is probably one of the most integral skills we can have in evaluating our programs, but it's also one of the easiest to learn. The outline for today's workshop is we're going to do a brief introduction, introducing you to survey design, why it's important, a couple of important facts about it. Then we're going to go really deep into question design and teach you how to make a really solid question that's empirically valid, mostly empirically valid, and will give you, most importantly, an accurate answer, an accurate data that you can use to assess your programs and use that data to drive them forwards to improve. Finally, we're going to go into a little bit about survey design, talking about ordering of the questions, how should your survey look, should I just put everything in italics, what should I bold, what should I increase the size of, what shouldn't I increase the size of, and that sort of thing. Following this webinar, we'll be doing workshops on Monday and Tuesday. If you haven't signed up for a workshop, I'll send out a reminder link on following this workshop. And I believe as of now, the Monday workshop is on a wait list, and Tuesday has a couple of spaces open from 10 a.m. PST to 11 a.m. PST, Pacific time. If you can't make either of those and you really want to get in some practice with the skills we're going to learn today, send me an email. I'll have my email on at the end of this webinar, and we can talk it out, and maybe we'll be able to arrange something for you specifically. So the first thing I just want to mention is that surveys are science. They should be treated as such. There's a lot of science methodology that goes behind creating a great survey. Just like there's a lot of science that goes behind just creating great evaluation for our programs. And as such, we want to treat them like that. We want to treat them with the care and meticulous touch that we give our evaluations. And what I want to talk a lot about is reducing our respondent fatigue. Think if we give our surveys out to all of our respondents, and all of them are perfectly great. They're in a great mood. They're not really fatigued at all. But each question starts to fatigue them because it takes them a lot of time to process the question. Maybe they're trying to think of why you're asking that question. Maybe they're trying to figure it out. Or for a lot of the reasons we'll go over soon, it's going to start to give them a little bit of mental fatigue. And the more mental fatigue your survey respondents have, the more likely it is that they're going to give you an inaccurate answer. And this is the hidden thread of surveys. There's no real way to gauge this. There's no real way to kind of pull this out of your data other than looking at the survey questions and saying, are these questions good? Could this question possibly fatigue or mislead our participants? And I want you to think of it as this way. Imagine every participant, every person you give your survey to starts with 0 points of fatigue. And every question that is a little misleading or takes a little bit of interpretation for them adds a point of fatigue. Or maybe it'll add 2 or 3 points depending on how bad that question is. If by the time you give your 20th question, they're on their 20th question for their survey, and they've racked up a lot of these mental fatigue points, the rest of the information they're going to give you is likely going to be inaccurate or not really represent what they truly think or what they truly feel. So what we're going to talk a lot about today are ways to reduce this respondent fatigue. I'm going to go over a couple of the really common types of errors that occur in surveys. I'm going to kind of really lightly touch on the first 3. And this is because the first 3 are non-response error, sampling error, and coverage error. Each of these 3 types of errors have a lot to do with the methodology behind you giving the surveys out. For example, non-response error has a lot to do with you only sampling. When you give your survey out, you're only giving the survey out to certain people. And these certain people respond significantly differently than other people that you ideally want to poll. Sampling error is another one where you're only really sampling some of your overall population and not all of them. A good example of this is imagine if you have 5 clinics and you want to do a general satisfaction survey to your clients and see how you're doing among all of your 5 clinics, and you only send your survey out to your 3 largest clinics. you're not pulling the other two. And there's a chance, and a very good likelihood, that those other two clinics may be significantly different from your other 3 clinics. So you're not really getting an overall picture. You're only getting a picture of those 3 clinics that you've surveyed. And measurement error is the type of error we're really going to talk about today. And measurement error is the chance that if your questions are worded poorly or they're misleading, they lead to your participants giving an inaccurate or incorrect answer. Now, like I said, the first 3 questions have a lot to do with sort of the research design behind your survey and not the actual design of the survey itself. This is when you really want to get in touch with your evaluator or with somebody who knows, or access CEBA if you don't have access to those resources, and get behind them to get a really good research methodology behind your survey going. But what you can do now is really focus on those questions and start thinking about, is the survey itself, is our tool that we're using to assess our progress good at all? And one of the examples I like to give to this is, imagine that you've built your dream house. You've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe you won the lottery or something. You've won hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you put it all into building your dream house. It's perfect. And one of the last steps of building a house is you want to bring an inspector in. The inspector checks over everything, make sure you follow with code, make sure that your house is going to remain, and it's going to be great for the coming years. When you bring that inspector in, do you want to pay for a cheap kind of cut rate inspector, or do you want to pay for a really good inspector, given you put all of that money already into your dream house? You want to spend more money on that, right? Well, surveys and evaluation in general are the inspector, and the house is the program, is your program. You put so much money, and we put so much money and effort into our programs that in a lot of these steps, you may be thinking this is going to increase the length of my survey. This is going to make me print out a lot more pages, and this is going to take a lot more money to do. But you don't want to skip out on the last piece, evaluation and survey design, because this is what really is going to drive your program to the future and help it adapt and change to your clients and your participants' needs. So having said that, a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from Dillman's tailored design method. This is one of the many different survey design methodologies that have been created over the years, but Dillman's is one of the most scientifically researched methodologies. If after this workshop and after you've completed the work groups, you really have a burning desire to know a lot more about survey design. Maybe you want to know a lot more about the different types of methodology errors that I mentioned beforehand. I highly recommend you pick up this book, Mail and Internet Surveys, The Tailored Design Method by Dillman. I believe this is the most recent published edition by him. But if you just search for Dillman and survey design on Amazon, you'll come up with a bunch of books that he's written that are highly valuable. So what I'm going to go over are a list of about 19 or so principles or rules for writing survey questions. If you write anything down, if you're taking any sort of notes, and if you're not taking notes for this workshop, I recommend you pick up a pen and paper and write these 19 rules down. These are kind of the testament of survey design. Ideally, what you'd want to do is, after this workshop, when you're looking at your survey design questions, go make a checklist out of each of these different principles and say, did I follow this principle with this question? Did I follow this principle? Did I follow this principle? The more you do it, the more these are going to be kind of ingrained in your head, and you'll just start to be able to do them naturally without even using the checklist. And what this will do is this will ensure that you're not going to really run into that, to those misleading questions, those misleading answers. So the first rule is kind of a no-brainer. Choose simple over specialized words. But when I'm talking about simple over specialized words, and what Dillman means by this is it's not just using kind of a set of vocabulary, the lowest common denominator. You want to make sure everyone can understand it. You're not using really advanced words. But in all of our fields, in every field, not just HIV and AIDS, but in every field, we have our sort of own lexicon. We have our own set of words, phrases, acronyms, and terms that we're accustomed to. But people outside of our own field may not know that. And even our clients may not know that because they don't work as intently with it as we do, at least in the fashion that we do. So for example, if I say that we really want to push linkage to care, we all know what that means. At least I'm pretty sure everyone here should know what linkage to care means. But will our clients really know what that means? Will they really know all the nuances that are associated with that phrase? They won't. So ideally, you want to be able to spell out exactly what you want to say. A bad example of a question, one that violates this rule, is, when was the last time you accessed care? What do you really mean by access care in this question? Somebody might respond and think, yeah, you know, I talked to my friend, he's a doctor, and I got some advice from him, so I accessed care like a week ago. But that may not be our definition of access care. We may be thinking something along the lines of going to the doctor to talk about our HIV status for whatever means, or another interpretation of it. So as you can kind of see here, and what's going to be kind of a common theme is we do not want to leave any room for our participants to interpret our answers. We want to be as clear and as defined as possible with them. Rule 2 kind of contradicts the last one, because I just told you want to spell it out and take your time and really phrase it out, but at the same time, you do want to choose as few words as possible to pose the question. An example of this is, did you eat any kind of food for your visit today? This could easily be shortened to, have you eaten today? And this is kind of a delicate balancing act between, do I want to clarify more, or do I want to keep it as short as possible? And really the rule of thumb is, be as clear and as concise with your question as possible, but also be as short as possible. I know it's kind of hard, and it's kind of contradictory, but you do want to aim to do both of those at the same time. But ultimately, never sacrifice the interpretation to shorten whatever your questions are. Rule 3, or principle 3, is use complete sentences to ask questions. Kind of a no-brainer, but an example of this that you may not think of is if your question is just number of times you've been tested, fill in the blank. This could easily be just kind of fleshed out to be how many times have you been tested for HIV and AIDS. There's a small chance that with this question, they may misinterpret it. And you never know, so you really always want to use complete sentences. Rule 4 is you always want to be precise with what you ask for. And this is talking less about the question and more about the response categories, A, B, C, and D, that you give them. For example, if I ask you, how often do you get tested for HIV and AIDS every year? Never, rarely, or sometimes. My rarely may be your sometimes. I may think that rarely is, oh yeah, I get tested like once every few months, because this is something that's really important to me, but for whatever reason, I only rarely get tested. So somebody who's not as aware, especially people who really aren't involved or haven't really been involved in HIV and AIDS, they may think being rarely tested for HIV and AIDS is once every 3 or 4 or 5 years. Or may even think like I get it once a year with my physical when they really don't. So you want to flesh out your response categories to be kind of not at all, 1 to 2 times, 3 times. Spell it out as clearly and as precisely as possible. The 5th rule or principle is don't ask for too specific information beyond the respondent's ability to answer. And what this is talking about is, if I ask you this question, so in the last year, about how many times have you been to a bar? Can you really give a 100% accurate answer to this? We know from a lot of, just for example, eyewitness testimony research, our memory is very malleable. It can be very influenced by recent events, things that have been talked to us about, or even the survey questions that come before this question. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we don't want to ask for too specific information. If you're really interested in knowing about how many times they visited a bar in the last year, maybe you're trying to see where you should be able to distribute your condoms. You can split this up into response categories. 1 to 20 times, 21 to 100 times, 100 plus times. And what this does is it gives a higher chance that they'll give you an accurate answer. It may not always be accurate, and I doubt it'll always be accurate. You'll never get 100% accuracy. And just from what we know about research design, survey design, you don't need 100% accuracy. It always kind of balances out unless it's kind of an intentional or unintentional error in the survey questions, which is what we're trying to correct right now. Rule 6 is you always want to use an equal number of positive and negative categories for scalar questions. And scalar questions are the strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree kind of questions. And what happens if you give a question like this with response categories like this, if you say, How satisfied are you with the clinic's cleanliness? I'm completely satisfied, mostly satisfied, somewhat satisfied, et cetera, there are far more positives than negatives in response categories. And this kind of primes them to think, oh, there's more positive, and I'm really just asking that. So they're going to be more inclined to give you a positive response. You correct this by just making sure that you're giving an equal number of positive and negative response categories. Rule 7 is distinguish undecided from neutral by placement at the end of the scale. And this is a tricky one, and this is one that's very frequently ignored but shouldn't be. So we're going to use our last example, our last correct example too. So we have an equal number of positive and negative categories, and we actually have a neutral too. So I'm neither satisfied or dissatisfied with a clinic's cleanliness. But all of these kind of assume that I've been to your clinic. I could go to your clinic and think, you know, I'm not really convinced that it's very clean, but I'm also not very convinced that it's dirty. So I just kind of have a neutral opinion. But what if I haven't been to your clinic? All of these are assuming that I've been to your clinic because I have to have some sort of opinion about your clinic's cleanliness. We can correct this by, at the end of our scalar questions, add an undecided or no opinion option. And what this is doing is giving those people who haven't even been to your clinic, who may get your survey for whatever reason, give them an out to the question. And say, well, you know, I really don't have an opinion about this because I've never seen your clinic. This lengthens a lot of your survey and a lot of your questions, but it's worth the hit. It's worth the extra cost because it's going to make your responses, or the responses you get, and the data you get, a lot more accurate. Rule 8 is you want to avoid bias from unequal comparisons in your response categories. If I ask you which of the following testing methods do you prefer, the incredibly fast 1-minute rapid test or the slower 30-minute HIV test, you may think you're giving them kind of a descriptive of it and you're helping them understand it more, but incredibly fast, that instantly makes me think that this is better. Of course I want a faster test, but you want to leave that to them. You want to leave that to your respondents to interpret and to decide on. So you can just fix this by removing the adjectives, the 1-minute rapid test or the 30-minute HIV test. Rule 9 is you want to state both sides of the attitude scale in your question stems. Now this actually refers to the question itself. And this is another one that's really, really frequently violated. If I ask you, how much do you agree with 10-cent condoms being sold at bars? How much do you agree? Now, what this instantly causes your respondent to think is, well, I only agree with this a little bit. I'm actually really against this, so I only agree with it like a tiny bit. And they're going to say I agree with it a little bit. But that's not really what they think. They really think that they disagree with it. So you always want to say agree or disagree, the positive and the negative in your questions. Rule 10, and this is one of the most contested ones. Whenever I help an agency out with their surveys or their evaluations, and this comes up, this is one that always sees a little bit of debate. Eliminate check all that apply questions to reduce primacy effects. Now I'm going to break this down a little bit. Check all that apply questions are questions in which they can respond to more than one category. Frequent examples are, which of the following places do you visit? A bar, a bathhouse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Privacy effects are really just priming, and to make it really simple to understand, it primes your participants to only, or to remember more easily the beginning options instead of the latter options. So if you have 10 options they can check down, they're much more likely in the end to check the first 3 to 5 than they are to check 6 through 10. Because the first 5 that they read are going to stick out in their mind a lot more. Which of the following clinics would you like to see offer reduced cost treatment? Here's a question that's just check all that apply. And what you need to do to kind of fix this is break it down into one question for every response category. Or for every response category. This looks a lot longer, yes. But now you get multiple benefits out of this. A, you avoid the primacy effect. You're avoiding them being more likely to respond to one choice than the other choice, and that's always good. B, you can get a little more data out of this now. Now that you're actually extending out to multiple questions, you may be able to see not just how they'd like, if they'd like to see it or not, a yes or a no, but you're getting into how much they really want to see it. And that is always good. And actually, I'm going to scroll back up because these are actually kind of bad examples of response categories. Here, you'd ideally want to have 2 positives, a neutral, and 2 negatives. So there's a little oops on my part when in creating this. So rule 11, develop mutually exclusive response categories. This is much easier illustrated in an example than just talking about it. So from which of these sources do you first see our awareness at? We want to see if they've actually seen our billboards or our banners. Were you driving on the 101 or were you walking down the street? But what if I was driving down that street? Or what if I was walking by a bridge on the 101 and I saw your ad? They don't have a response. And especially if you're requiring everyone to check everything in your survey, if this is an online survey, or if it's not, they may just check one of these at random and say, yeah, this kind of agrees with me the most. So always make sure that they're more mutually exclusive. This just kind of removes the driving or walking condition because that's kind of inconsequential to what we really want to see. We really want to see if they've seen that ad or not. Rule 12 is you want to use cognitive design techniques to improve recall. Cognitive design techniques sounds really cool and fancy, and it sounds like these are a set of secret skills that you can use. But really, it's just kind of breaking a question down into multiple questions so it's much easier for your respondents to recall what they've done. We do this in a lot of our counseling and in a lot of our just really in a lot of our counseling. We want to be able to bring them back to that situation and then have them specifically recall that moment. So here's a long question to begin with. I want you to think back about the last time you came to get tested at a clinic. During that last test, how anxious were you to see your results? This is a mouthful. This is not just a mouthful, but it's also, it's jarring because now you're asking them to think back and answer a very specific question. What we want to do is we want to break this apart into multiple questions. We may not care as much about the first couple of questions, but ultimately this makes the last question, the one you're really, really anxious to see, and you really want to see the results for, much more salient and give you a much better response. So we break that apart by asking them first, when was the last time you came to get tested? Get them in the right mindset. They're thinking about, okay, so I kind of came to get tested 6 months ago. Okay. You can ask them, what were the reasons for getting tested? This is kind of a tricky one because since we want to see how anxious they are, or how anxious they were, we want to see if the reason was one of the reasons why they were anxious. So I might think like, yeah, you know, I had an incident of unprotected sex, and I think that I may have accidentally, I may have the HIV virus now. The third is our most salient question. This is what we really want. How anxious were you to receive your results? We brought them back to that moment, and now we're asking them our greatest question. Rule 13, provide appropriate time reference. Another one that's easily explained by an example. So if I ask you how many times you've been tested in the last 3 years, even if you give a response category to this, even if you say 1 to 10, 11 to 20, etc., this is just really hard for them to think back for. Again, our memory is really malleable. We may not remember as much. I can't remember what I had for breakfast a week ago, much less a very specific amount of things over a very long period of time. So the only way to really correct this is just kind of say, all right, we're not going to be able to ask them for over a course of 3 years, maybe 6 months, at most like a year to remember back. And that's really if you have really wide response categories, like 1 to 20 times, 21 to 50 times, etc. Rule 14 is make sure each question is technically accurate. Very simple one. You don't want to just give them misinformation. But also what I've seen in a lot of these, and remember, a lot of these questions, a lot of these examples I've pulled from actual surveys I've seen in the past. So all of these have happened, and frequently happen as well. Should we look into preventing the spread of HIV through being scratched? We know that you can't just scratch someone and spread the virus. But this may mislead them, and this may make them think, well, wait, really? Wait, can you actually get scratched and get the HIV virus? If you're really looking into this, you may need to add a disclaimer to this, like this can't currently happen, or you may just want to completely reword the question. Rule 15. Choose question wording so that comparisons can be made with previously collected data. I know the first thing a lot of you are going to want to do once this is done, once this is over with, and you've been able to practice these, are you going to want to go back and fix all of your surveys. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as this, because one of the things we have to really be cognizant of is all of the work we've at least put into collecting our previous data. Even if it's a little inaccurate, even if our questions are still a little bad, we can't change our question wordings too much, because what's going to happen is when you change the question wordings, you're getting different responses. And what this does is scientifically, we can't compare the two questions anymore. Even though they're both asking kind of the same thing, we can't mesh the data together because we know that these are actually just fundamentally different questions, at least structurally. So my recommendation is make small changes, and if you're really motivated to start changing your questions and changing your survey data, I recommend you either talk with your evaluator and get your evaluator's help in doing this. Your evaluator should ideally be the one doing this in the first place, or access SIBA. Access SIBA so we can take a look at your surveys more intensely on a one-on-one basis and see what can change and what can't change. Just like you need to access SIBA in order to adapt a DEBI, we ideally want to access SIBA to be able to change these surveys just to make sure you're getting the best data possible. Otherwise, keep your survey questions the same, and then think about revising them for your next contract. Or think about revising them for the future when you won't necessarily need to make those previous comparisons anymore. Rule 16, avoid asking respondents to say yes in order to mean no. Isn't it great? A question like that is very confusing and instantly takes a second to process. Anytime you have a double negative, or even at least triple negative, I've seen a quintuple negative, like 5 instances of reversing the flow of the question in a single question. It adds a lot of mental fatigue, and it just takes a lot longer for your participants to respond and think and flesh out the question. So isn't it great that Obamacare will have new healthcare options for you? It takes a second to think about, doesn't it? And there's no reason to word it like this. There's no reason to phrase our questions like this. So instead of saying, isn't it great, just ask them, how do you feel about Obamacare providing new healthcare options for people living with HIV and AIDS? Rule 17, another one that's really frequently violated and really frequently broken is avoid double-barreled questions. Don't ask 2 questions in one. Because in an instance like, if I ask you if you're, when going to work and when coming home from work, how often do you see our advertisements, our billboards? What if I only see your billboard going to work? And you may not be interested in that data now, but what if in the future you're really only interested in looking at, was one of our billboards more successful than the other? Or was one of these options better than the other? You can't piece that apart from a question like this. And it's not just confusing, but it'll give you inaccurate data in the end. So break it apart into 2 questions anytime you see a double-barreled question. So instead of asking that, you say, when going to work, how often do you see them? And when coming home from work, how often do you see them? Rule 18, we're almost done. We're almost over with these rules at least. Soften the impact of potentially objectionable questions. In our field, especially in HIV and AIDS, we're very accustomed to talking about sex, condoms, all of these things that the general public, like if you just went outside into a shopping center and started talking out loud about the kind of stuff we typically talk about in our environment, you might get a couple of heads turned, you might get a couple of people kind of offended. And really, that's just what we want to avoid. We want to avoid our participants being offended by our questions. And this leads back to kind of a priming effect where Say in our very first question, we ask them a question like, are you gay? This is a poorly worded question. This may offend some people. And what happens is instantly, right off the bat in your survey, your person is offended. They have a negative attitude, and they're going to be very, very unlikely to give a positive response to many of your answers. They're going to be more likely to give a negative than a positive. So you always want to make sure that your questions aren't really objectionable. They aren't really offensive. Make sure they're worded correctly. For a lot of demographic questions, look to the CDC. Look to whoever your funder is, likely has a set of demographic questions kind of spelled out. This is the way we want to see your information collected. And use their wordings because they put a lot of thought into them, or hopefully put a lot of thought into them. An example question is, have you ever knowingly put someone who is HIV negative at risk with unprotected sex? I'm a little offended because you're insinuating that I put somebody at risk. I never do that. I'm offended. You could reword this by asking, have you ever had unprotected sex with someone who is HIV negative? Instead of insinuating that you're putting someone at risk, you're just saying, have you ever had unprotected sex? And this leads into a much better interpretation from the respondent than the previous example. Rule 19, and I believe our last one, is avoid asking respondents to make unnecessary calculations. Say for a question you're really interested in the percentile of your surveyed people that are satisfied with your services, or the percent of times in a month that somebody went to a bar and had sex. You're asking them to do the percentiles in their head and give you a percentage. A, they may just give you a rough percentage that may not be accurate, and B, now they're doing extra mental work that they don't have to be doing. So always break it apart, even into multiple questions if you have to. To get the percentage, you can ask, how many times in the last month did you go to a bar? And then how many of those nights did you have sex? You get A, more data, more stuff you can look at in the future if you're diving into your collected data to see different explanations for why things happen in your program. And B, it's just much easier to interpret for your participants. So now our questions look great. We've gone over these 19. I know it's a lot. And I know 19 is really a lot to go over. But trust me, the more you use them and the more you just kind of go over them for every question you create, they become second nature. And they become second nature to the point where you're going to start seeing other surveys and being a little like, oh, this is wrong, and this is wrong. And that's great. You'll see them even in other surveys you start taking for fun. But now that we have our questions, how do we put them in the survey? Let's talk a little bit about constructing your survey. There are around 3 steps for constructing a solid survey. And the first one is you want to create a desired navigational path for reading all of the information presented on each page of the questionnaire. A, you want to be aware of how do we typically read something? We always read something, we start at the top of a page, and we go from left to right typically. So if we go from left to right and we're creating our survey like that, you want to be able to make it very clear like that. And one of the things you shouldn't do, and I'll talk about that in a bit, is create 2 columns. You have column 1 over here on the left side of the page and column 2 over here on the right side of the page. But if you do this, you want to make each column very visible and very apparent. Include arrows if you have to indicate that the respondent is supposed to fill out all the way down first, then back up to the next side of the page, then all the way down again. This is creating that desired navigational path. And we're going to talk about some techniques to do that. You want to write each question in a way that minimizes the need to reread portions in order to understand that question. And this kind of speaks back to their survey design, to our principles for writing a survey question. If you follow those, each question is going to be very easy to understand and very easy to interpret. Done. If you have items in, say, you want to know how strongly people agree, or if people agree or disagree with a set of responses, like a set of clinics that you have, you can place them into an item in a series format. So you can ask how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements. Statement 1, I like or dislike this clinic. Spell it out. and then just keep on filling out, kind of like A, B, C, and D of question number 1. You can do it, but don't do too many of them at a time. Never go over, like, say, 10. Even if you have more than 10 response categories, rewrite the question, because you want to be able to remind them of what they're answering, because it's been a while since they've actually gone back up to what the original instruction or the original question was. So you just want to make sure you do it carefully. Place your instructions exactly where that information is needed, and not just at the beginning of a questionnaire. This is always broken. This is always done. We are very familiar with surveys, and we take that for granted, because somebody who may not have filled out a lot of surveys, a lot of our clients may be ESL. A lot of our clients just may not understand how to fill out the questions correctly. If you front load all of your questions to the very top of your survey or the very front page of your survey and you kind of forget about them, they're going to have to flip back to those instructions every time they come across a section they don't know how to answer. That's bad. That adds extra time to them responding to the survey. That gets them a little more fatigued, and we just don't want that. So say, for example, that you're including scalar questions, strongly disagree, strongly agree, that sort of thing, the 1 to 5. Include instructions for those at the beginning of that section, and try and place all of them in kind of the same section. By doing that, you're reducing the need for them to flip back to the instruction sheet to reread the instructions and saving yourself time and them time. Minimize the use of matrices. This is kind of different from what I was talking about before by grouping them in an item in a series. Each of these questions, so when this is asking, please select which supplier best meets your needs for each of the following. Best product quality, printing capability, the fastest, etc. Don't do this. Spell each out, each response, as its own question, and you can place them in an item in a series, but don't use a matrix. The rule says minimize it, but if at all possible, just avoid using matrices as possible. There are different reasons for this. A, they're kind of difficult to navigate, because if I'm responding to the middle one, I kind of have to like trace my finger along the path to where my response is, just to make sure I'm answering the right question. Also, it's kind of also for the same reason that you don't want to use check that apply questions, check all that apply questions, because they'll get the privacy effect. They'll be much more likely to answer the first few better than they do the last few. So overall, minimizing use of matrices, if you're really stuck, like for the very last thing, when you're formatting a survey, you're like, I have this down to like 10.2 pages. And if I put this in a matrix, like these 3 questions in a matrix, it'll get it down to just 10 pages. That's fine. You're only using it once, you're only using it a little bit, and you're not using a lot of it. But overall, just try to minimize the use of them. And just ask one question at a time. Don't front load a lot of questions. Just like our matrix is asking a million questions at the same time, spell each question out. By doing this, it's just a lot easier to read and a lot easier to interpret. Step 2. Create visual navigation guides that will assist respondents in adhering to the prescribed navigation path and correctly interpreting the written information. That's a mouthful. But right here what we're talking about is, how do I use bold? Should I use italics? Should I have size font 14, 16, 18, 32? We're going to talk about that for the next couple of tips. Increase the size of written elements to attract attention. So say there's one really important term that you're using. Don't do this a lot, but it's fine to increase the size of that one term a little bit. But frequently what you'll want to do is maybe make the instructions. If your entire survey is size font 12, very easy to read on paper, that's fine, easy to understand. Maybe make the instructions size 14, size 16. And what this will do is direct them to, oh, I have to read these instructions first. These are important. So you're just helping them kind of create that visual navigation path overall. And just a little bit about size font and type of font and all that fun stuff. Size 12 is fine. Size 12 is kind of the industry standard for this is readable on a sheet of paper. And if you'll notice now, recently, probably since around 2007, a lot of our word processors have started to use the font named Calibri as the default font. do not print in Calibri. The reason why our computers have started to use Calibri instead of Times New Roman, which a lot of us who've been working with computers for a while are very familiar with, is because Calibri is specifically designed to be read very well on your computer screen. That's what it was really designed for. That's what it was chosen for, and that's why it's kind of the default now. Times New Roman was chosen before as kind of the standard because we never expected to read a lot of the stuff on our computers. We expected to have printouts and print everything out. So Times New Roman, size font 12, will always be the most readable you could possibly make your font size and type of font category. I'm sure there are some others out there, and maybe there's some research out there that proves that one type is a little bit better, but it's always safe to go with Times New Roman size 12. Next, increase the brightness or color of visual elements to attract attention and establish appropriate groupings. So you can maybe increase the lightness, make your instructions a little like bright gray if you're doing in monocolor. This also helps guide them to the instructions. And that's probably the only time you really want to use color, I think. And typically you're not going to use color because a lot of our surveys being administered are going to be in black and white. Next, you want to begin asking questions in the upper left quadrant. Leave information not needed from the respondent in the lower right quadrant. And what I'm talking about here are your company logo, your mailing address. A lot of us have headers. For a long time, we had headers on ours with our company logo and a lot of information about us. Here's our address, here's our name, here's our point of contact. Since our respondents read from the top left and down, unless you're administering a survey in Asia for whatever reason, you'd want to start in the upper left quadrant. So leave all of that stuff to the lower side. It's still important and it's still there, kind of like we have on our PowerPoint, in the PowerPoint you're viewing right now. We don't have our logo. We don't have any fancy graphics in the upper side because we want you to start with the most salient information first, which is the stuff on the slide, not our company information. You can use dark print for questions and light print for answer choices. This just helps them know and guide them to, oh, I know that everything in bold is a question, and I know that everything in light print is an answer choice. It just makes it easier at a glance for the people you give the survey out to distinguish questions from answers in your survey. So if we go over and we combine a lot of the stuff we've just learned, maybe you have your instructions, bolded, size font 14, Times New Roman, going good. You have your questions bolded, and you use like a very dark gray, which will print out much less than the bold for your answer choices. And that'll create a very easy, simple to understand navigational path for your respondents using black and white, not having them go fancy with color. If you have very special instructions as a part of the question, keep it as a part of the question. Don't keep it separate. And what I'm talking about are, this goes even beyond just Likert scale questions, the scalar ones. I'm talking about if you're getting very fancy with your methodology and you're using semantic differentials. If you don't even know what that is, that's fine. You can ignore this. But if you're using really fancy questions that require very specific instructions, include those instructions right next to those questions. Don't include them in the beginning. This is kind of reiterating it from one of the previous points, but this is very important for any that requires special instructions, because a lot of people may just glance past it if they don't have instructions right then and there and incorrectly answer your questions. List your answer categories vertically. This is another one that's very frequently gone against, and it's kind of okay to go against this because this can take up a lot of space. My personal recommendation is don't break this. Always list your answer categories vertically, and keep in mind that just because your survey is 20 pages instead of 15 pages, it doesn't mean it's going to take them longer to answer it. I've seen 20-page surveys that took half the time to fill out that 10-page, to compare to like other 10-page surveys. And this is because the 20-page survey was very well done. Each page was kind of light on content, and it was very easy to understand. So the person just kind of flew past each of the 20 pages. And what we found in a lot of the research is that participants don't care if your survey is large. They care if it's incredibly large. If you hand them a giant booklet like this big to fill out, they'll start freaking out. But if you give them like a 20-page survey, which is like 10 pages front and back, that's fine. Sure, it's going to take a little more paper to print out for you, and it's going to take a little bit more money, but think back to your house. Do you really want to have a shoddy house in 2 years because you kind of skimped out on the important part, the final part? You spent so much money, and we spent so much time on our programs, don't skimp out on this. So I'd really recommend you list your answer categories vertically. It may take more space, and it'll definitely look like it takes a lot longer, but it won't. It'll take the same time, and it just helps them respond much better. And the reason for this is kind of the primacy effect, but it's a little different. But typically, they're going to be able to remember the first ones horizontally better. They'll remember, and they'll answer the vertical one. Vertically, they'll be able to look at it as a picture. Horizontally, they won't. Consistently run your scales in one direction, for example, negative to positive, throughout the questionnaire. This is also another one that's broken a lot, and this is a bad one. This is a super bad one. Fortunately, this is one that can kind of be fixed when you're looking at your data, if you've done this. But what I'm talking about are, say we have all of these scalar questions, strongly disagree to strongly agree. When you're listing them out, strongly disagree, agree, neutrals, agree, strongly agree, always keep the same format. You always want to start from disagree to agree at the bottom, or agree at the top to disagree at the bottom. Whichever way you do it is fine. It doesn't matter. But just make sure you remain consistent with it. And consistency is kind of a thing you have to be aware of. Like if you bold things, if you bold one word in your survey, bold the same word every time in your survey. Don't be inconsistent with that either. But this is one where if you say, if you're flipping back and forth, and even if like one is like strongly disagree to strongly agree, and the next one is very satisfied to very dissatisfied. Even though you're asking the same thing, you're still flipping positive and negative around, and they're kind of second guessing you. There's a couple of things that play here, and there's a couple of things that may have an A. They may think that you're trying to trick them. They may think that, oh, this guy's really trying to get into my head. I'm gonna fool him. I already know what he's trying to do. You never want them to try and figure out your true intent with the survey. Ideally, you'd want to give them your true intent anyways at the beginning of a survey in the instructions and the cover letter. But you never want them to try and second guess you. And also, they just may get so accustomed to going from positive to negative or negative to positive that if you flip it around, they may not even read the response categories and say, oh, yeah, number two. Number 2 is disagree. I know that. But if you flip it around and number 2 is suddenly agree instead of disagree, it's flipped in the opposite direction. So the simple summary of this is, if you look at your surveys and you've seen this done, just understand that the responses are more likely to run in the opposite direction. This will happen very frequently, and this will probably happen in all the times it happens. So that it might have a light slant to the direction you changed it from than the direction you changed it towards, if that makes sense. Step 3, and this is kind of a short step, is just develop any additional visual navigation guides. And this is talking about if you have skip logic in your survey. So if you answered yes to question 1, skip to question 3. If you answered no to question 1, skip to question number 2. Spell it out, have instructions for them, and make it very easy and simple for them to understand. As well, words and phrases that introduce important but easy to miss changes in respondent expectations should be visually emphasized consistently but sparingly. And what I'm talking about are, don't smother your page in large font and bold and colors and pink and rainbows. That's bad. Use all of these emphasis tools, all these visual navigation tools we've been talking about sparingly but consistently. So if you're bolding the instructions, that's fine. Bolding instructions every time they appear. But don't go ahead and bold the instructions, bold the text to your questions, and bold extra stuff in addition. Be very consistent with it and use it sparingly. We're going to talk a little bit about question order right now. So what about the order we put our questions in? We have a great set of questions, but what order should we start in? First, you want to start with your most salient question, but make it an easy question. So let's break this down. What I mean by a salient question is, usually in our surveys, we have one burning question. We have one thing that if we take a look at our logic models and our outcomes, there's one outcome that we really strongly identify with. We want to know, are they satisfied with our services, for example? Maybe you want to start with that question. Just start. Question number one, start with, are you satisfied with our services? How strongly do you agree or disagree with this statement? What you're doing there is, A, there is zero mental fatigue. Hopefully there is zero mental fatigue when they enter your survey. They have a clear mind. They're not risking any of your questions, kind of priming them to give a different response. And they'll give you a very truthful answer to this question, hopefully, especially if you follow the 19 principles to creating that question. But you also kind of want to make it an easy question. Don't make them like do a really strong recall as their first question. And this is, by just following the principles that we've gone over, you'll do this innately. So say you just really want to know, were they anxious when they came in to get their HIV test last time? Use the cognitive techniques that we went over before to help them recall the information. So start with question one, bring them back. Question two, bring them further back. Question three, the most salient one, give it to them. Even though it's not your first question, it's still kind of up there, and it's still the one of the most oriented, one of the most prioritized questions. Organize your questions by topic. This is relatively simple. If you're talking about your house test for your clinic, then you want to talk about stigma with HIV and AIDS, then you want to talk about this category and this category. Just organize them more by topic than by response category. Don't try to cram in all of your questions onto the same page just because they all happen to be Likert scale 1 to 5 questions. Organize them by topic instead. Frame each topic with instructions. Just like I had mentioned before, you want to include instructions. And if you have sensitive questions, put them near the end. So if you actually have a potentially objectionable question that you can't reword, you can't rephrase, and you're going to risk them being a little angry about it, put it near the end. If they're a little angry about it at the end, unfortunately they'll be a little angry about it, or they may even feel a little great about it. They may be put in a great mood by your question. But if it's not going to influence any of your questions because it's the last one they do. They fill it out and then they're done. They hand in the survey. People really aren't going to rip up their survey just because of one question near the end of the survey. And another kind of category of these sensitive questions are, bizarrely, your demographic questions. And this is a little different, but if you want to ask demographics about your participants, how old are they, what's their ethnicity, what's their sexual identity, this sort of thing, put them near the end. Not because necessarily we're going to risk them being angry or negative about it, but they may start to respond to your questions as sort of a paragon of their demographic. For example, if I start filling out a survey and I write down, I am a 20-ish-year-old Caucasian male, I may start thinking of each of these questions as, well, what would a Caucasian, what would I think as a white male in this field? You don't want them to think that. You want them to think, what would I, Patrick Stanley, think of this question? Well, how would I respond? So always put your demographic questions at the end of your survey instead of at the beginning of your survey. And this is also one of those things that if you're already doing at the beginning of your survey, it's kind of a tough luck thing because this may potentially drastically change how your respondents answer your questions. So just leave it as is for now. And think about when you reconstruct your survey as a part of your next contract or as a part of a change to your program, then think about putting them at the end. So we've gone over a lot. It's almost time to go to the questions and answers. So what else we kind of need to take into consideration? And I'm going to glance over these and talk about them just a very, very tiny bit, but you'll just need to know about these. So the first one is what we kind of talked about before, with those first 3 types of errors, is your sampling, your research design. How do you decide who to give your survey out to? This is one that really needs to be handled by somebody who has a good handle on scientific methodology, especially like social science research methodology. Your evaluator, maybe look to capacity building assistants. If you have an agreement with the university and they have researchers, those are great people to go to. And what also, like I mentioned, send me an email. Send whoever you've been working with, or send a CRIS request for capacity building assistance. And us, capacity building providers, we're funded by the CDC. All of us are to give you help with stuff like this, especially the more technical and the more complex aspects of your program. So please don't be afraid to submit a CRIS request and try and get assistance with that. And if you need assistance with that, shoot me an email afterwards, and I can definitely get you help. Next is a survey delivery format. Do we want to do an online survey? Do we want to do a mail survey? Do we want to do an in-person survey? And really, this is just kind of up to you, and this is kind of up to, you know your participants best. You know your clients best. If you know that a lot of your clients may not have a lot of access to computers, may not have steady access to internet, maybe an internet survey isn't the best idea. Maybe you want to send out a mail-in survey, or maybe you want to survey them when they come into your clinic. And in addition, maybe send people out to the community, to bars, and just have them give the surveys out. This is another thing that can really be answered by an expert, but also just in general, never, if you're giving an in-person survey, stand over the person. There's a lot of social desirability that comes into play when people are filling out a survey. And I've been talking a lot about surveys, but also, I mean, let's think about what we really commonly work with in our field as surveys. One of the most common are our intake forms. So when somebody comes in and they need to fill out a form to be admitted to our clinic or be admitted to our program, they need to fill out an intake form. That's a survey. And what I've seen happen a lot is it may be a one-on-one counseling session that's happening in which the intake form is administered. And I'm standing right here, and I give the survey over to someone there. Maybe I'm behind a desk, or I'm sitting next to them, or whatever. But if I'm in their proximity as the person who's giving the survey, they're going to be much more likely to give a socially desirable response. Basically meaning they're going to respond the way they think that I want their answers answered. So all in all, say for example, if you're giving surveys out like intake forms as a part of your program, give them the survey and maybe step out of the office you're in with them, or maybe step away from them, or maybe send them back to the waiting room to fill out the survey and then bring it back into you. You want to make sure that they feel as anonymous as possible with these surveys. And this is a lot of what happens to do with why we have specific like identifiers on our surveys, like codes instead of names. And finally, just the graphic design of the survey. Really, we've talked a lot about the graphic design of it just by talking about how should you emphasize your questions. But all in all, contact either your graphic designer or just create a very, very simple survey in Microsoft Word. It doesn't have to look fancy, so long as your questions and your question order are very salient and very easy to understand. So I wouldn't worry about the last as much. But this is definitely another area you could look into assistance for in order to make your survey just a little bit nicer. With that said, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this workshop. Before we get to the questions and answers, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be having work groups for this survey design workshop on Monday and Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific time. Our work group on Monday is full up. You can sign up for it and be put on the wait list. And I won't be able to guarantee that you'll get a spot for that Monday. So we have a couple of spots open for the Tuesday work group that I'd highly recommend you sign up for if you haven't already. If by chance neither the Monday nor Tuesday work groups work for you, shoot me an email. My email actually isn't listed on there. It's pstanley@apla.org. And it'll come up on a future slide too. Or you can give me a call. And we'll try and set up something, even if we have to do a one-on-one. I want to make sure that all of you have a good handle on this by the time you're ready to take a look at your surveys. So just shoot me an email, shoot me a phone call, and we'll set something up if you can't make the Monday or Tuesday work groups. With that said, I'll bring it back to Miguel Honda, and thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Patrick, for performing, for doing this workshop with us. So I just want to go ahead and open it up for questions. So I'm going to go ahead here and take a look at any questions that may have popped up.
Just 1 second, please.
can we get a printed out copy of this presentation? The answer to that would be
yes. We'll work to both not only get the slides to this sent out by the end of this afternoon, but it'll also be available on our website, which you can see at sharedaction.org.
And I think the next question, aside from some, when would the workshop be posted for to be able to be printed out, which I believe is going to be this afternoon?
This afternoon.
So please, you'll get an email in regards to your participation in the workshop and some additional information if you need it. But you can go ahead and email Patrick directly if you don't get a copy or don't have access to it. But you can check out on our website at sharedaction.org, and the workshop will eventually be posted there. And we're looking at this afternoon for it to be posted. The next question is, will there be a webinar on evaluating surveys? Patrick?
Well, really our surveys are kind of evaluation tools themselves, and these principles and these steps and these guidelines are kind of a way to evaluate the surveys yourself. If you just make a checklist out of these, and if you just kind of make a list of all these things that we've been talking about in this workshop, and for each question go over them, if each of your questions passes all of the principles, then ideally you have a good survey.
Another question, Patrick, is what is a non-response error again? Like, just briefly for that.
A non-response error is essentially it's the result of people who respond to your survey being different from those who weren't given your survey. And this is only really in a relevant way to your survey. And an example of this is, let's say we send out a couple hundred surveys to see why repeat testers are coming into our clinic. But on the day that these are administered, say we only get like 10 repeat testers in, and we know we have a much higher amount of repeat testers that come, but it just so happens that day, that very day, they didn't really get a lot of them. That's an example of a non-response error.
This next question is in regards to the balancing of, especially when it comes to like the usage of a matrix. You discourage to check all that apply, but in situations such as listing tools used in medication adherence, how would you balance out the use of a matrix versus other type of survey question?
This is a hard one. Usually, now a lot of medication adherence tools will come from the CDC, and will have their own surveys. And also, I just want to mention, if this is like if you're looking at a survey that is actually given to you as a part of a DEBI or as a part of a CDC program, and it didn't actually come from you, that was created by you, don't touch it. Because typically, then a lot of times, or if you want, or if you feel like it could be improved, get in touch with your project officer or get in touch with SEBA, and we'll take a look at it and see if this is something that can actually change. But a lot of the times, they're collecting data in a very specific way as well. But in a situation like that, like I said, you want to minimize the use of matrices. So in the example you gave, where you're just listing the different types of tools used in medication adherence, I would lean towards it's okay to use a matrix in that. But just be aware that if you're using a matrix there, then you may not want to use them at all in the rest of your survey, or very few more afterwards.
Another question is, can some of the same principles of survey design be on an intake or such as case management tool?
Yeah, both intake forms and sort of like, I'm imagining my case management tool, you're imagining kind of the same thing. These are all surveys. These are all different forms of surveys that we're using. An intake form typically is a survey that has a lot of demographic information on it, but you can still use a lot of these principles to kind of tailor your intake form and make it as good as possible. And especially a lot of times in your intake form, you may just have a question of everyone that comes to your clinic that you really want answered. So you include that on your intake form and kind of follow these principles. So for example, if you're just really curious about why people come into your clinic, or why people decided to join your PCC program, or anything else, include that as your first question on your intake form. Because as we know, a lot of the intake forms are demographic questions, and as we went over, the demographic questions go to the end instead of the front. So always include your salient questions like that at the front. And also, one thing that I kind of glanced over that this reminds me of is when you're reviewing your questions and you're reviewing your question order, you always want to go from the general questions you're asking to the specific questions you're asking. What I mean by this is, say we're looking at satisfaction for services. Ask the general question first, such as, how satisfied were you with our services today? And then break it down with further questions such as, were you satisfied with the wait time? Were you satisfied with the results? Were you satisfied with this and that? All that are kind of a part that bring together that first question, satisfaction. But you're going from the general to the very specific questions because the way people typically respond to these questions. For example, if you give a very specific question and follow that up with, were you satisfied at all? They may leave information out from the specific when they're going back to the general. But people will always give more detail from the general to the specific. If you have another question about that, and if I didn't phrase that exactly or I didn't phrase that in a way that's easy to understand, go ahead and ask another question about it, and I'll try and explain it a little bit better. And I'm also seeing that somebody clarified that they meant analyzing surveys instead of evaluating surveys. We could potentially hold something for analyzing surveys, but typically, since every survey is different, and you're asking a lot of different questions with each survey, this may be something that's more in line with capacity building assistance, where we go in and we help you analyze your data specifically, where instead of us just either imparting, like teaching you how to analyze, how to analyze the data, and then leaving you to it with no further interaction from us, or us just doing it for you, the best way to kind of approach assistance with analyzing surveys is to request capacity building assistance with analyzing your surveys, where we go through it with you. So we know you get a little bit of you get your hand held through the entire process, which helps you learn it much better than any webinar will, and it'll help you learn it specifically to your surveys and your questions than the more general. And if you'd like help for submitting a CRISP request for that, or if you want to help with the language you want to use for that, shoot me an email, and I'll definitely help you out.
Okay. Well, if there's no more further questions, if there's any questions that do come up later on, Patrick is available to answer those questions. You can email him directly at pstanley@apla.org. Just so, again, another reminder is that the workshops will be next week. Like Patrick stated, the Monday is full. If you have not yet registered for the Tuesday, go ahead and do so today. And if you have any further questions, there will be Patrick's contact information, and he'll be more than happy to help you out. So thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you all for attending today. We greatly appreciate it. You have a great day.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you everyone for attending. And as well, along with the slides, which will be sent to you this afternoon, you'll also be receiving a sample survey. Look over the survey and kind of practice applying some of those principles that we've gone over today to that survey. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going over that survey in our work groups to try and apply some of this knowledge that we've learned. So if you have any further questions, you can see my phone number as well as my email there. If you have any questions about other assistance that we've been able to provide in the past, you can go to our website at sharedaction.org and sharedactionhd.org. And just to follow up, you'll receive a survey evaluating this webinar at the as soon as this closes. So please fill that out. Our evaluations, just like you want to design a great survey, they help us drive these webinars. They help us drive these workshops to make them as great as possible and as tailored to you guys as we can. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.